In 80 Days, adventurer and award-winning filmmaker Paul G. Roberts retraces the global footsteps of Phileas Fogg, hero of Jules Verne's most famous work.
Jay-Z, the billionaire rapper who once sold crack on the city streets below, calls it the Empire State. You might know it as the Big Apple. But whatever you know it as, it's one of the major urban centers of the world. Hi, you know me, my name's Paul Roberts, and this film is the history of New York City. Now, all the way back from its initial purchase for $4, that bargain price, right up until the post-COVID 2020s, where I've just been in New York. Now, New York City is a vital driver for the entire United States economy. And at one point, I used to say to anyone that would listen to me that it was the cultural center of the known universe. I called it the ultimate urban experience, and to me, it really was. But it's funny, in 2023, after just visiting it, the Big Apple seemed to have lost some of its gloss. I wonder whether it will come back. It's been up and down many times in histories. Now, the history of New York City is so complex and so involved, it could actually be its own, series of books and matching instead of encyclopedia editions, as well as, an ongoing series just on New York City. But for the purpose of this episode, I'm going to try and keep it brief, or as brief as I can. And this is the history of the Big Apple.
There was a man called Christopher Columbus, and he grew up in Italy. Later he learned to be a navigator and how to sail a ship at sea. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue for Spain to gain an Indies shortcut that was new. How could he find a shortcut to the Indies, bring silk and spices quickly home? He needed someone with a lot of money. He couldn't do it all alone. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue for Spain to gain an Indian shortcut that was new.
We all know in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Now, Christopher Columbus was born in 1451. He was born in Italy, in Genoa, and his dream was to sail west across the Atlantic Ocean to get to India, of all places. And that's where he thought he was going. Now, Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand of Spain finally agreed to pay for his expedition to the Americas in 1492. But did Columbus really discover America? Let's check the facts, because there is some dispute, or I guess some contradictions there. Validated accounts have it that Vikings were actually encountering Native Americans in the Americas as far back as 1000 AD. And that's 500 years before Christopher Columbus set sail on his ocean blue. Columbus made a total of 4 trips during the years of 1492 and 1504. His first trip, or his first voyage, as you all know, was the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. They were his flotilla, or his flotilla of boats that went with him, his armada. And after 1 month of sailing, he didn't get to India. He actually discovered or spotted the Bahamas, believe it or not. And he thought, incorrectly, that he'd reached Asia, or the Indian subcontinent. So he called this new land the Indies, and he called the people there Indians. Yes, Christopher, they were Indians, West Indians. And discovering the Bahamas, as he did, he didn't even land on American soil. There were already millions of people living there. Native Indians, or native West Indians, or regardless of what they were called. But regardless of that, we don't want to let fact get in the way of a good story. And in America, he is celebrated as the founding father of America, the United States. And Americans get a day off work on October the 10th every day. And it's called Columbus Day. There's processions down the street in cities like New York and I guess all around the States. And it's an annual holiday that commemorates the day when the geographically challenged Italian Christopher Columbus officially set foot in the Bahamas and claimed the land for Spain. And it's been a national holiday in the United States ever since 1937. So it would probably be more accurate to say that he introduced the Americas, mostly the southern parts, the southern Americas and the Bahamas, to Western Europe. And during his 4 voyages to the region between 1492 and 1502, it's safe to say he paved the way for a massive influx of Western Europeans and ultimately formed several nations, including the United States, Canada, and even Mexico. But I think more than anything, he just drew the attention of the Europeans to that part of the New World. So what was New York City, or New York, like before the arrival of the Europeans? The lands of New York comprised of 2 groups, and they weren't Native Americans, obviously. There were the Algonquins and the Iroquois. But how is your recall of the early 1600s? Well, just to give you some references, in 1605, Cervantes' Don Quixote de la Mancha, the world's first modern novel, is published. In 1606, Jamestown, Virginia, established the first English colony on the American mainland. Pocahontas, daughter of Chief Powhatan, saves life of John Smith. In 1609, John Kepler publishes his Laws of Planetary Motion, which explains the movements of planets around the sun. And in 1610, Galileo Galilei sees the moons of Jupiter through his telescope. Galileo also showed the Copernican system in which the planets circled the sun was correct. And in 1616, the bard William Shakespeare died. Europeans arrived in New York Harbour around AD 1600. Henry Hudson, an explorer from England, was tasked by the Dutch government to explore New York. He first arrived on Manhattan Island in 1609, before sailing up the river which was later named in his honour, the Hudson River. And after 4 years of exploration, Mr. Hudson found the area was very inhabitable and therefore informed the Dutch government that they should be putting people there. So in 1613, the Dutch sent their explorer by the name of Adrian Block, whose expedition led to the first buildings on Manhattan Island. It's interesting to note that the Pilgrims on the Mayflower didn't land on Plymouth Rock until 1720. So it was way before then. So obviously, the native inhabitants were going to be colonised by the white Europeans.
Prior to the arrival of the Europeans, the Cherokee lived in villages along the major rivers. There'd be 100 to 600 people in a typical village. They were an agricultural people. They farmed corns and beans and squash. They also supplemented the farming with hunting deer and elk, gathering wild foods, fishing, but agriculture was the basis of their society. Their typical house arrangement would be a round winter house that they live in the cold months, and then a rectangular summer house was more open-sided, pretty much keep the rain off, and you'd have 2 or 3 small outbuildings for storage.
The first attempt to settle and colonise with the Native Americans came in 1614, when a Dutch settlement known as Fort Nassau was established. And in 1624, the good old Dutch West India Company sent a group of settlers to establish more settlements and forts. They later built a fort, Fort Amsterdam, to protect the newly established colony. And later, Fort Amsterdam was incorporated as the city of New Amsterdam under the administration of one Peter Stuyvesant, the city which would later be named New York City by the English who came later. Now the Dutch colony continued to grow and prosper for the next several years, laying the claim to the surrounding lands as well. They traded with the Native Americans for local products which were popular in their native country at the time. Now the name Manhattan came from the Lenape word, which is Manhattan, which means the place we go to get our bows, obviously for our bows and arrows. In 1654, the Dutch built a wall to protect Manhattan. And many years later, when the need for the wall was history, a street took its place. Can you guess what the name of the street was, which once was a wall and now is a street? Yes, it was Wall Street, the centre of the financial district. Now, many of the local names came from the old Dutch titles. For example, New Haarlem was New Haarlem, after a town in Holland, and Brooklyn was Brooklyn, also Dutch. And then people from other countries, including Italy, started arriving, and also England started to move into the area. But in 1664, several ships carrying good old English soldiers arrived in the city of New Amsterdam, and they forcefully took over the Dutch colony, and the colony renamed the colony to New York. The next phase was under the British rule, which was 1664 to 1783. There was just over a century of English rule until the English and the French, who had also settled in the area, decided to go to war in 1794. The war, commonly referred to as the Indian War, involved a lot of fighting between the two countries and lasted until 1763. The English settlers teamed up with the Iroquois, while the French settlers formed an alliance with the Algonquin tribes. In the end, England won, and consequently the area remained an English colony for years afterwards. For the British, it was a strategic port. Hence, New York began to experience rapid development. The first newspapers appeared around 1725, and the first theatre in 1732. In 1754, they founded Columbia University, then called King's College. And between 1700 and 1776, the population grew 5 times, from 5,000 to 25,000 people. A dark side, however, in the early colonization was the conflicts with slaves. And after a series of fires in 1741, 18 of them were hanged and another 13 burned alive. In 1775, the fight for independence. The American Revolution started when New York, together with 12 other colonial blocks, decided to rebel against the English. In 1770, after some early scuffles between the Americans and the British, and in 1775, the American Revolutionary War broke out in full. Now, the real war actually started in 1775 when the Green Mountain and Ethan Allen boys formed an alliance and captured Fort Ticonderoga. And in fact, one of the most fiercely fought battles of the American Revolution took place in the city of New York. This war, commonly referred to as the Battle of Long Island. And it was fiercely fought in 1776 and led to England overcoming the Continental Army and again taking control back of the city. George Washington was unable to seize the city, and thus it was under British rule until 1781. However, the ultimate Revolutionary War, which led to the victory of the Continental Army, started in 1777. The war, commonly known as the Battle of Saratoga, General Horatio Gates led the rebels to the hard-fought victory. The English army, under the commander of General Burgoyne, not only surrendered, but they abandoned the claim and they had left the region completely. Now, New York City was the home of the young American Republic. It was the nation's capital until 1790. After all, it was the second largest city next to Philadelphia. And following the war, trade routes returned and the city's ports began to grow quickly. Besides, the stock exchange on Wall Street was officially born in 1792. And as a result of all these new developments, the population soared once again. By 1810, there were over 200,000 people living there. The Commissioner's Plan of 1811 expanded the city, the whole of Manhattan. It also designed the grid system and the layout of all the streets. And they are the same grid and pattern that you will find in today's New York City. In the end, what was shaping the city more than anything, though, was immigration. And there were waves and waves and waves of boats coming from the old world to seek a new life in the new world. They came from all corners of Europe. Thousands of immigrants came each week. And these groups built their districts around Manhattan. More importantly, they started businesses, schools, unions, and clubs. And henceforth, New York was rich in culture like no other city in all of America. Of the total of 500,000 New Yorkers in 1850, over 50% were from overseas. According to the 2020 census, there are 9 million inhabitants of New York City. One child has been born here every 4.5 minutes for the last several years. And you wonder what kind of a world they're being born into. For America, New York is utterly crucial. It's an island suspended between the Atlantic and the American continent. And it's estimated that nearly 50% of everything that comes into America comes in through the various ports of New York City.
Got to feel in heaven when my lover's near. Lord, let this moment.
The Civil War of 1861 to 1865 saw various conflicts occur in the city, yet it did not stop the influx of immigrants and the swift growth of the city. Notable was the political machine at that point. Tammany Hall, a local political group of the Democratic Party. Founded in 1788, it rose to power and had substantial influence in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Yet it was also a symbol of chronic corruption. Between 1857 and 1876, Central Park began to form. Frederick Law Olmsted and Calvert Vaux were the architects of this enormous 843-acre project. In addition, 2 more inherent symbols of New York came to life during the 1880s. The first one was the Brooklyn Bridge, which opened on May 24, 1883, after more than 13 challenging years of construction. By the same token, on October 28, 1886, the city finally unveiled the Statue of Liberty. The statue was designed by Frederick Auguste Bartholdi, and it was a gift from the French to celebrate America's 100th year anniversary. The next several decades, the statue was the first thing that arriving immigrants saw, and for them it was a symbol of democracy, hope, and a fresh start in a new world. Regarding culture, the theatre district settled on Broadway, and in 1883, the first concerts in Carnegie Hall amazed listeners. In 1892, an immigration station opened on Ellis Island with a view of the Statue of Liberty, and until the station closed in 1954, an astonishing 17 million people were processed through that station. So what came to define the New York City of today were the late 19th century mergers. In 1898, Greater New York was born or reborn as Brooklyn, Queens, Bronx, Staten Island, and Manhattan, the 5 boroughs. The population increased to over 3 million. And what made the consolidation of the districts work was the opening of the subway, which was in 1904, and the Grand Central Terminal, which was opened in 1913.
January 1916, the second winter of the war. On the Western Front, the Germans were preparing a new offensive. Its code name was Gericht, judgment. An offensive needs supplies. This was just one of 10 new railway lines that the Germans were edging forward, sleeper by sleeper, rail by rail, scalpels cutting into the heart of France.
From the first half of the 20th century, the city began to expand once again. However, this time it swelled upwards rather than outwards. And while not technically the first New York skyscraper, the Flatiron Building opened in 1902. And then a boom came. To quote a few early towers, there was the MetLife Tower, which opened in 1909, the Woolworth Building in 1912, the Chrysler Building in 1930, and Rockefeller Plaza in 1933. Besides, as the tallest building at that time, the Empire State Building opened in 1931. When the Empire State Building was built in 1932, or opened in 1932, it was said that it was the closest place to heaven that a human being could be. However, it was not all bright and shiny, because on October the 29th, the forceful stock exchange collapsed and Wall Street crashed. And as a result, the Great Depression swept in and began an era of suffering and austerity for virtually everybody. At last, the election of Republican Fiorello LaGuardia in the mayor's office, 1933, helped New York to get back on its feet. In addition, Robert Moses, a famous urban planner, adjusted the city to the 20th century by building a network of roads and bridges, highways, and more. Yet a new crisis emerged with the rise of Nazi Germany and the start of World War II.
Our minister to Denmark telegraphed that a German offensive was being talked about. This was immediately confirmed by news from Switzerland of the concentration of 400,000 men in the region of Verdun.
A regiment of engineers was immediately sent to Verdun to strengthen the defenses on the east bank. Time was running out. German deserters were crossing the lines in ever-increasing numbers with stories that all leave had been cancelled, that something terrible was about to happen.
The United States joined the war after the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. And during the war, New York City was a popular destination for refugees. Many politicians from occupied or war-decimated countries found asylum in the city. And from another perspective, the city's harbor was a major hub for shipping soldiers and supplies to Europe. Optimism spread throughout the city as World War II ended in 1945. The return of war heroes and the decision to place the headquarters of the United States in New York only underlined it. The far-reaching urban development under Robert Moses truly exploded in the post-war years. Overall, the city became the economic, the cultural, and the political center of the entire world. As white collar replaced blue collar, industry left the city, hence many more skyscrapers with thousands of offices rose to the sky. And these changes caused a slight decline in the population. Besides, the city fell into an immense financial crisis in the 1970s. As ports and industries left, Lower Manhattan was somewhat empty and left behind. Thus, David Rockefeller came up with the idea of a World Trade Center in the 1960s. And after years of struggle, the Port Authority completed the world-famous Twin Towers in 1972.
Shadows fall and trees whisper day is ending. My thoughts are ever wending home. When crickets call,
However, it took a few years before New Yorkers actually accept this work, the work of architect Minoru Yamasaki, and got used to the Twin Towers. At first, people used to joke they were the two boxes that the real, legendary skyscrapers in New York the Chrysler Building and the Empire State Building were packaged in. The city was on the brink of bankruptcy when President Gerald Ford agreed to a $2.3 billion loan. And at last, Democratic Mayor Ed Koch restored the city's finances during the late 1970s. And during the entire 20th century, New York had a severe issue with organised crime. At last, a team of prosecutors, including Rudy Giuliani and others, managed to tackle it and get on top of it in the 1980s. From then on, the city stabilised, and after the end of the Cold War, welcomed a fresh influx of new immigrants into New York. Besides, in 1993, Giuliani, a Republican, became the city's mayor, and while in office, he continued to go after the mobsters head on. Yet the gangsters and crime were not the darkest problem New York had to face. On September the 11th, 2001, two hijacked planes crashed into the Twin Towers. And as a result, some 2,750 people lost their lives in New York City alone. And what's more, the two towers actually collapsed. It was one of the darkest days or darkest periods in the entire history of the city and the United States in general. The attacks of September the 11th were intended to break our spirit. Instead, we have emerged stronger and more unified. We feel renewed devotion to the principles of political, economic, and religious freedom, the rule of law, and respect for all human life. We are more determined than ever to live our lives in freedom, and those are the words that Rudy Giuliani released following the attacks. New Yorkers did not intend to fall into despair. They came together. Together they saved lives. Together they cleaned up the city. And together they rebuilt it. And on the tragic side of the 2001 terror attacks, in the blueprints of the two towers, a memorial emerged. One World Trade Center was completed in 2014 near the original site, standing at a symbolic 1,776 feet. It's the tallest building in the Western Hemisphere. Today, New York City is a city home to over 8 million people. It continues to be the financial and cultural center of the Western world, as well as a symbol of diversity and equality. People from all around the world still want to come to the city to live, or at least to pay a visit for a few short days. Last but not least, the skyline, just like the city as a whole, continues to develop, making space for new skyscrapers.